class. Today we are going to look at Lightroom, some of the more advanced panels in Lightroom, or other panels, I guess, in Lightroom. Because the basic panel, where it is basic, these are the most commonly used functions in Lightroom. They're very robust. So are nice, just to keep that in mind. These are in addition that we're going to be looking at. So I already started playing around with this image, so I'm going to reset it, and I'm going to look at my histogram, and you can see it's one of those. It was shot in the shade. It was actually a very bright and sunny day, but I was under this great big tree and I'm very close to it. It's some green moss that was growing on a pine tree, but it was a heavily shaded area. You can see the blue cast on the green is from the shade. Shade tends to have cool light, which creates a cool cast on your photograph. So if you were to photograph a person, their skin might look a little dead in the shade, and you might need to warm it up. So I'm gonna do a few quick things in the basic panel. Maybe not that far, so I'm gonna warm it up a little bit here. I'm gonna brighten the exposure because it was I would say a proper exposure there, just because it was such a neutral, very flat lighting. I'm having to force those highlights to come out. Now I did bump up the contrast a little bit, and I'm increasing that using some of these other tools, but I really want the texture and some of this contrast to come up, and then I might need to go back and adjust some of these. So where so once I added that clarity, when I really bumped up the clarity, it affected my shadows. So it's, you kind of go back and forth between these, and if you change one thing, it could affect the other. So you're just kind of massaging things back and forth. And I'm going to lower that vibrance just a little bit because it looks a touch on the acidic side to me. So I'm going to pull that down, maybe add a little bit more magenta in there so it's slightly more pleasant to the eye. So that's all I'm going to be doing in the basic panel. I do want to go and show you a few of these other panels. Now normally I would always be looking at my histogram, but I'm going to close that just to have the screen real estate here. But note that anything that we do in these future panels that we're going to be looking at, and we're not going to cover all of them, but a lot of them today, just keep in mind that any adjustments that you make in any of the other panels can affect the histogram, and you might need to go back to the basic panel and make some adjustments. That happens a lot when I add a vignette. So just keep that in mind, and that you'll normally, with any adjustments made, you'll start with the basic panel, but you'll also end with the basic panel. And of course, you're always looking at your histogram. That should be the first and last thing that you do, is to analyze your histogram. So I'm going to go ahead and close the basic panel just to have a little bit more screen real estate. And actually, I'm not going to do that quite yet because I want to show you the tonal curve. So the tonal curve is here. You'll notice highlights, lights, darks, and shadows, and you can isolate those. These are very similar functions to what you're doing, or the same functions that you're doing up here. I typically don't use the tone curve panel just because it is just kind of a repetition. It's a different interface, and some people like seeing the graph and moving specific points. So if I know I want my highlight point here, or if I want it in a certain area, I will make that adjustment. So I'm going to leave that here. I'm going to close this. Just know that it is there, and if you like that panel and you prefer to do your highlight, light, dark, and shadow adjustments on an actual graph, then the tone curve panel is for you. So the next thing I want to look at is the HSL panel, or the color panel. Now, these are synonymous, the color panel. It's just a different interface in how you look at this. So if I clicked on all, you can see I can look at I can just like scroll down here, or I can see my sliders for saturation, hue, and luminance, all on separate panels, so you're not scrolling. I usually use it here. Again, it's a preference. You might like the scroll, that might feel more efficient to you, or you might want to see things in this view where you're actually picking specific colors. So I want to see what the green does, and I want to be able to adjust the green all at once. I do use this sometimes, especially on photos like this one that are heavily saturated with one color. So this is a very green photo. I was taking a picture of a green moss. It's I would say would fall under a monochromatic or a single color photograph. So I might use this color panel instead of the HSL view. They're all the same. But I do want to show you something that's kind of interesting about this. Now, it seems like, yes, hue, saturation, and luminance, those are all color related. So you would think that this panel would only work with color images, but if I switch this over to black and white, I can still affect those color layers. So and they're not actually color layers, they're specific isolated colors within the photograph. So I can move those around. I do think it's kind of interesting in photographs, and this happens a lot with grassy images that have a lot of grass and trees or fall foliage. You'll think that the images would have a lot of orange in them, so you'll mess around with the orange, but then you'll realize that it's yellow. It happens a lot with grass, that our eyes are perceiving grass as green. But really the majority of the photograph is yellow. So interesting. I think a lot of it is, what we expect. We expect grass to be green, and so our brains process the grass as green, but really in actuality it's more yellow. So keep that in mind. If things aren't adjusting the way that you think that they should be, try another related color. So they do work in black and white, so it's adjusting that, but I'm going to go back to the color panel here. So I'm just going to collapse basic now so we can go back. So hue, saturation, and luminance are all different color options. So I can take the green color here, and I'm going to just focus on that because that's what this photograph is, mainly a green, has a definitely heavy green. So I'm going to take this and show you what the hue shift does. And you can see that I can actually shift my green so it has more of a yellow green, and in this case, because there's so much green in it, it's really turning into almost an orange yellow. Or I can take it up, and now we're like in the kind of really like a soft leprechaun green here. So that is the hue. So I'm gonna mess around with my hue a little bit here, maybe change some of the aqua. Really want to play around with getting a little bit more contrast in the color. So the hue is shifting the actual local color, where the saturation is the purity of color. So I now have my color, and I can bring that color saturation up so it's much more saturated, or I can bring it down and it's almost black and white. And I might want to bump up the yellow. Yeah, the yellow is kind of fun there. And then I might go to my yellow and make that different tone here. Again, lots of yellow and green in this photograph. You would think by looking at the original that it was mainly just green. So the saturation is a purity color. The hue is the specific local color of green. So whether it is a kind of minty green or yellowish green or turquoise, once it hits turquoise, you're getting down to the aqua level. And then we have the luminance, which is the lightness and darkness of the color. So I can brighten up my green or I can darken my green. So I might darken my green and then brighten up my yellow. Or maybe I'll do the opposite. I think I'll do the opposite. Okay, so there's my luminance. You can pick all different colors. I might pick this photograph here because it has a little bit more different colors in it. So I'm gonna try to isolate some of that blue and aqua, purple that exist. And then I'm gonna bump up the saturation on all of those. And actually bump up my saturation of those, not decrease it. Then I might bump up my saturation also just across the board in this photograph. So now we're turning into something that's a little bit more interesting. I definitely want to darken my green. But I have to be careful because I do see here that I'm starting to get, when I play around with this a little bit too much, you can see this posterization. It looks all pixelated. I don't want that. So that's going to make it look very false and fake. And all of these edits, I want to look fairly natural. So I'm going to zoom back down, just hitting Command-. So that's the HSL panel. Play around with it. It is great. I'm going to pop back over to this image here, and I'm going to close the HSL panel, and we're going to look at split toning. A lot of my photographs that I do, and I'm going to show this one, a lot of my photographs do have a split tone, and that is a process that a lot of black and white photographers, which I was a black and white darkroom photographer, do split tones. So you have a tone for the highlights and a tone for the shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the split tone. What I do like about split tone is images like this that tend to be a little flat. You can add a little bit more color to them and depth. And it's more about the depth than the color. So I'm adding some more green into my photographs, into the highlights. But then I really want to add like a darker, almost purpley color to the shadows. And so I'm picking the specific color and then the amount of saturation that goes into it. So maybe it's a little bit too, there we go. So now I can also turn any of these panels. You'll see this little like on and off switch. So it allows you to see it before and after. And I really do think that it's starting to pop a little bit more. So like what's happening here. And then I can also the balance, like how much of this is highlight and shadow, like where in the line. Right now, if I were to cut my histogram in half, that's where it's putting everything in the exact middle of the histogram is like the highlight side, and everything to the left of it is the shadow side and is adding blue. And if I want to adjust that, I can have more of the highlights getting affected by green, or if I go the other way, I could have more shadow. So you can adjust this on a slider. Really fun panel. It's a specific look that some people enjoy, other people don't. I'm not going to go over the sharpening too much here, so know that it's here. You can sharpen your image. Just remember that your image doesn't actually, you cannot make an out of focus image sharp. That is done in camera. So if your image is out of focus, you're going to have to, in my case, knowing that my macro lens is really hard to focus, especially with really super shallow depth of field, then I'm just gonna shoot a lot and know to check that. But if you don't get it in camera in a different photograph, then you're going to have to reshoot. So, and lens correction is another one that is a little bit, this corrects lens distortion. So if you're shooting with a really wide angle lens, or if you get aberrations, this is something that I'll do a separate video on later, because it's pretty technical and might take up too much time. So the transform, if your image was shot, like if you were taking a picture of a building and it was shot out of proportion, this is where you can bring it back in proportion. This does distort the image. Also, there is cropping that exists here. So you are reducing the quality of the image by cropping, and so this is, again, something you try to do in camera, which we'll talk more about in person. So know that it's there, and if you have something that you really want to fix, there is your ability to correct images that have been shot with some lens distortion. Happens a lot, again, with architectural images. Now, vignetting. Ansel Adams said that all images should have a border, or a clear end to the image, especially with wide angle lenses. You'll get some light vignetting on the edge. I use the dark vignette on almost every single one of my photographs. Oftentimes these you don't even notice once I've done it, but it makes a huge difference. So I just did a really quick vignette, and I'll go over everything that I just did. But again, this little turning the effect on and off switch, so I turn it on, you'll notice that your eyes feel like they're bleeding towards the corner, and then I click it back on, and it feels like I have a little bit more focus. But you can see, like right now, this looks a little flat to me, and I'm not super happy about that, so I might go back to the basic panel and brighten up the image. Again, we always start and end with the basic panel. So what I did, I'm going to turn the feather all the way off so we can see this. So the feathering is off. The feather just creates a soft gradient so you don't have a hard line. But there are times where you might want that line there for a specific reason. But this just gives me, you can see what all these do. So the first one is the amount. You can actually have a light vignette, looks like a little pill, or a dark vignette. So somewhere in between. The amount, or the midpoint, so you have the amount, so it affects whether it's a light vignette or a dark vignette and how light or dark that is on the continuum. And then you have your midpoint. So how far into the photograph does it actually come? Is it just on the very tips, or does it come in a fair amount? And then you have your roundness, and this is the main reason that I wanted to show you the feather. So we've got a feather here, and or without the feather, because you can see how when I move this on the slider, you can go from a perfect circle to a perfect, almost just a rounded rectangle. So for this photograph, I kind of want more of that rectangular shape, because that's kind of following the shape of this object. So I'm going to bring that down, and then I will bring the feather back up to 100%, and I might back off the amount, because I want it to have borders. I want it to feel like it ends, but I don't want it to be super heavy. Also, you can have your highlights come through. This photograph is not a great example of this. You can kind of see how it affects up here, but notice if I allow my highlights to come through, and then if I don't, there's a little bit more shading that happens in the highlights. And then if you want to get a grainy look to your photograph, and you can't see the grain unless you're at 100%, so I'm going to bring that up to 1:1. And then you can see as I bring the grain up, and I can change the size of the grain. So you're trying to make this look more like a gelatin, silver gelatin print. So like the traditional film prints. So you can add that grain or not. You don't have to have it. I'm going to take the grain out. So the last one, so that's pretty much it for the effects panel. That's your vignette. The last one that I am going to look at is a very important panel that doesn't get used very often because most people haven't done color printing in a darkroom, and so they don't really understand how all of this works. So you do have your tint that you'll notice. So if I bring my tint in, and that can be from magenta to green, that's the casting for the shadows that I might want to bring up. But then I also have my primary colors, my red, green, and blue. Remember, we're working in an additive color wheel, and the red, green, and blue color layers are the primary color layers for anything that we capture in a color digital camera, or any camera that's shooting color. So I can isolate any of these colors, and I can shift the red. This is something that you don't do very often in in the color darkroom, but you have a red color wheel, a green color wheel, and a blue color wheel, and then you're allowed to add more of that red color and more of the green or less of the green. Now if I add both red and green together, red and green light make yellow light, you'll notice that there is a yellow cast. I can enhance that by also increasing my blue. So you can play around with these, but again, this is a more advanced tool, and it's not going to do the things that you're expecting. So when I add it to the magenta, I'm expecting more magenta. It's actually adding magenta light, and it is interacting with the colors of the photograph. So it, as light would, and actually magenta doesn't exist. There is no magenta light wave. But anyway, so so just keep that in mind, that this is how light is blending in, and light is very different from paint. So the additive color wheel is a little bit more complex. So you might just need to play around with these sliders to get the effect. You'll start seeing through trial and error how these all work together. But know that they're there, and it's a really cool way to enhance your photograph. And if I really have a hard image that I can't color correct in any other color space on Lightroom, this is the one that I'm going to use. So I hope all these panels, I know that was a lot of information, but it should get you started.